discussion today is, of course, Israel post 10/7. Of course, as I said before to other groups, the jury is still out. We don't know what kind of Israel will emerge ultimately post 10/7, but we do know several months went by. We do know several things, and I'd like to share them with you and then present mostly, what we know, question. One of the things that amazed visitors whenever they came to Israel after a terrorist attack, and we've had periods, at least during my career in the Foreign Service, that were pretty traumatic. I don't know if you remember that in the early 1990s, there was a wave of stabbings. Palestinians were knifing people in the streets of Israel. I don't know if you remember that. That was the background to the defeat of Yitzhak Shamir's campaign against Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin won the elections in 1992, and this was really the background of his victory, the knifing, the stabbings. Then you had the Intifada, the second Intifada. Buses were exploding left and right in Israel, suicide bombers. There were over 130 successful suicide bombing attacks, so to speak. And so what amazed people that came to visit is how quickly Israelis recovered from those attacks. And so Israel's resilience post 10/7 is tested yet again. The Israelis are recovering very quickly. However, there are certain things that will require more patience, more time, and more effort. For example, we just heard about another Iran proxy, the Houthis out of Yemen, attacking deliberately underground communication cables, trying to damage internet connectivity, not just that will affect Israel, it actually affects Israel less than it affects other countries in the region. But the danger is that the Houthis' activity in the Red Sea will have an impact, already has an impact on shipping, and that could be translated long-term into a supply chain problem, just as we experienced during COVID. Travel right now, oddly enough, is the number of visitors coming into Israel is impressive, but it's mostly people coming to show solidarity. I don't know what will happen once this will kind of subside. I don't know what will happen long term. I know that the recovery from the second Intifada, and the second Intifada claimed the lives of nearly 1,500 Israelis. We lost 1,400 Israelis in one day on October 7th. Here was 1,500 Israelis over the course of almost 5 years. It took many years for Israel to recover from the second Intifada in terms of the ability to build a robust, solid, stable travel industry in Israel. High tech is more resilient because high tech is based on ideas. It's intangible software, ideas, applications. So in the case of production itself, like Intel has a massive factory in Israel that produces hardware needed for computers, the blue chips and so on. But the problem with high tech is not so much the production or the operational aspects of the companies, but actually their ability to raise money, and we see the decline. And of course, Israeli leading exporters could suffer from the notion. There is this thing in social science that is known as the halo effect. What is the halo effect? I know I have one piece of information about a certain entity, and from that piece of information, I try to draw many other assumptions that are not necessarily related, meaning that one element, that one piece of knowledge is affecting a wide range of aspects of knowledge about that. So the very knowledge that Israel is engaged in this massive confrontation with Hamas in Gaza and possibly with Hezbollah in the north may create a negative effect, a negative rippling effect that could affect the ability of Israeli companies to thrive. And I can say safely that at least when it came to high-tech companies, Israeli companies were cheaper than companies in Silicon Valley, although they produce the same technology, operated in the same field. So historically, Israel was always a bit below the level of prices in Silicon Valley. What could be, by the way, to go back to the previous slide, let me just say that life in Israel is pretty much back to normal in the sense that, you still see we're back, battling traffic on our way to the office. Shopping malls are crowded. People go about their lives. Of course, we remember the hostages. We remember the fallen soldiers. We remember the bravery. We remember the tough decisions that we have to make. But again, Israel's resilience is tested once again, and the Israelis are responding in a very impressive way. What could be considered an achievement, a sufficient goal? Because you have to understand, Israelis understand, and this is why so many of us are so frustrated. We understand it would be impossible for us to really claim victory in the sense that we would like victory that we experienced in the 1967 war or even the 1973 war, which ended with a military victory, albeit a diplomatic defeat. Here, it would be very difficult because we were badly beaten on October 7th. So what could be a sufficient goal for the Israelis? It would have to contain three elements. The first is the crippling of the military capacity of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. We have a tendency to forget Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad is a sister organization, more radical than Hamas, that doesn't play by Hamas's rules, but comes from the same school of thought. So both of them present a significant military capacity. So one leg of that potential achievement is the crippling of their military capacity. We know that as an idea, Islamism cannot be eradicated, but the military capacity can be. The second, of course, would be the release of the hostages, which should have been, in the eyes of many, many Israelis, their first priority from day one. That some people even say that Israel should not have gone into Gaza before making a deal to release all hostages in return for all Palestinian prisoners. And then Israel could have gone into Gaza, and Israel would have been neutralizing that way Hamas's main leverage. Right now, Hamas is using the hostages as leverage. It's the only leverage they have. And that's what makes it more complicated. And then the third leg of the potential Israeli achievement is the end of Hamas rule. What does it mean? It means de facto that Hamas will be out of Gaza, will not be running the affairs of Gaza, will not be the governing body of Gaza. That would be the third leg. Now, all three of them are very difficult to achieve because they require international support, they require patience, they require massive investment, and also luck, because when you have military operating in a highly dense populated areas like Gaza, like what we did when I was a soldier in Beirut in 1982, you need to have a lot of luck not to get in trouble and not to cause the kind of collateral damage that attracts criticism from all over the world, which unfortunately happened to Israel throughout history many, many times, and also happened to the U.S. Army and the Allied forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. So today's subject is the mood and how Israeli society is dealing with it. So we're grappling with three massive questions. The first question that we're grappling with is the shock post 10/7. Remember, Israel as a brand was all about excellence in the field of security. It was all about, in the eyes of some people, Israel's brand was about being invincible. Again, I mentioned resilience, but more important than resilience, Israel represented in the eyes of many people, certainly many people on this call, as a winner. Israel was victorious. Emerged out of the ashes of the Holocaust, built a startup nation, a robust economy, a producer of knowledge, and with one of the best armies in the world, one of the best intelligence capacities in the world. How could that happen? And so the first shock is the shock that relates to the failure on the day of October 7th. The intelligence failure, the failure of the people that interpret the intelligence, and the failure of the army to show up on time, because many of the people were left to protect themselves for far too long on 10/7. All right, that's the first level of the shock. The second level of the shock was the weak response, the dysfunctionality of the Israeli government, of the institutions, in particular the civil service, from lack of welfare services to lack of infrastructure. The civil society volunteered in such a way that compensated, but that shocked Israelis. Here we are paying our taxes. We expect governmental agencies to function, to be ready for such a calamity. It did not happen. And then the third shock is, of course, the reaction of the world, where Israelis were convinced that this time clearly we occupied the position of the victim, and therefore we deserve the sympathy of the world. And all of a sudden, not only that the world is not sympathizing with us, the world is blaming us. And in some cases, the world is denying what happened on October 7th. To Holocaust deniers, it took several years. But in the case of 10/7, the deniers showed up after several days, in some cases on the day itself. And so these are the three levels of the shock that Israelis experience post 10/7. And remember, we do understand that failures do happen. It happened to us on October 6, 1973, happened to the Americans in Pearl Harbor, it happened to the Americans on 9/11. We do understand that, yet it's still shocking to many Israelis. You have to remember that the Israeli military is not only the largest organization in the state of Israel, it's also the largest budget in the state of Israel. No other organization gets more money from the government than the security establishment. So that's the first question that Israelis are asking themselves. How could this happen, and why it happened the way it did? Regarding the army, I must say that despite, and I think that we discussed this a month ago, that despite of the fact that clearly the army failed on October 7th, the reputation of the army is still very high because of the way they performed post 10/7. The army's performance in Gaza is extraordinary in terms of their ability to function, to achieve. We lost many soldiers, but we anticipated a far more intense battle in Gaza. And so the army is being held in very high regard by the Israeli society. I call it Israel's society and the IDF a love story. Despite the fact that Israelis recognize the operational failure, they do also recognize the high performance post 10/7, and the IDF is still at the heart of the consensus. When we talk about the expectations of the Israelis from the government, so when something like that happened, when 9/11 happens, when Pearl Harbor happens, when October 6, 1973 happens, you expect your leaders to say, it happened on my shift, I will take care of, I'll do whatever it takes. And Israelis felt that Israeli politicians, the political echelon, continues to play politics rather than set aside partisan politics and really deal with matters to help the nation. As I mentioned before, governmental agencies were dysfunctional. Some of them are still dysfunctional until this very day. Decisions that are being made by Israeli legislators are outrageous, even now in the middle of the war. And so one of the things that many Israelis find extremely disappointing is the fact that the government never said that the release of the hostages is the top priority. And we suspect that what guides them are public opinion surveys. And it's a very bad advisor because people are angry after such a calamity, after 10/7. People want revenge. People are frustrated. It's the wrong thing to do for leaders to turn to the Israeli people in the moment of their anger and ask them, what do you think we should be doing? That's exactly what happened. By the way, technology has done that to politics. Rather than leading by their instincts and by their conviction and using their moral backbone, politicians all over the world are turning to public opinion surveys to shape their policies. And therefore, from leaders, they're becoming led by the public. It's a twist that technology did in technology basically influenced, disrupted, if you may, politics and diplomacy that way. When the information, imagine if Winston Churchill had the ability to conduct immediate, in real time, public opinion surveys about what the British people is expecting him to say 3 days after he became prime minister, he may have changed the speech that he ultimately gave, and history could have been different. And so it's a very dangerous thing to turn to the public and see what they feel and shape your policy based on the public sentiment when the public is angry. It's the last thing you want to do, but that's exactly what Israeli politicians are doing. And of course, there's a great deal of disappointment that there is no clear strategic outlook for the day after. Mr. Netanyahu issued a document, a very brief document about his vision of the day after. There's basically nothing in it. So Israelis are very disturbed by that. And of course, when we speak about the world's reaction, and many of you felt that, several things bother us here in Israel. The first is the silence. And I suspect that the silence is connected to, so there are people that are silent because they just don't know what to say. They don't feel they have enough information. But many people are silent because they don't want to offend their Jewish or Israeli friends. They don't want to say to them, listen, I think that this happened to you because you didn't do enough to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's the wrong context, because Hamas has nothing to do with the national plight of the Palestinian people. Hamas is not about designing a better life for the Palestinians. Hamas is not about a political solution. So when people tell you, listen, you had it coming, they're wrong. This has nothing justifies what happened on October 7th. So that's the reason many people are silent. Then you have the deniers, people that deny what happened on 10/7. Okay, you can say that they're Twitter crazies or TikTok lunatics, but they exist. Someone is feeding them with information. I've seen some of those influencers, getting engaged in those kind of conversations that basically put the blame on Israel and ignoring the context of jihad. And that's a dangerous idea, because the jihad is against the entire West. The jihad is against modernity. Jihad is against everything that we represent. They say it's not what you do that bothers them, it's what you represent. And the same motivation that led Al-Qaeda to attack America on 9/11 is same motivation that led Boko Haram to abduct 300 girls and rape them and mutilate them, and the same motivation that led ISIS to murder and mutilate and rape Yazidi women. The same motivation led Hamas on October 7th. It's true that all those jihadist, Islamist, genocidal groups are different sometimes in their ideology and their theology but ultimately they're all fundamental, a bunch of fundamentalists interested in the past, not in the future. They're all death cults, glorifying death, not life, and they're all about control. And they're being led by cynical people that never send their own children to be the suicide bombers, if you notice. The leaders are always staying at the Ritz-Carlton in Doha. You will not find them in the front lines. And so they don't lead by example. And it's all about control, controlling women, controlling assets, controlling real estate, money, and so on and so forth. Very little concern with the future of their people, whether the Afghani people, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Islamic Brothers in Egypt, or the Palestinians. So this is why Israelis are so shocked by the reaction of the world. Now, add to that, to everything I just said, the fact that Israel is more ethnocentric than other societies. Okay, every society is to a certain degree ethnocentric. And it's necessary for the consolidation of our identity. For example, I'll give you an example of American ethnocentrism. I'm sure there are many baseball fans here on the call. And so, how do you call the championship of Major League Baseball? Right? You call it the World Series, totally ignoring the fact that baseball is being played in other places, such as Japan and Latin America, and many of the big stars of the MLB, of Major League Baseball, actually come from Japan and Latin America. Like I knew Mariano Rivera when I was the consul general in New York. Mariano Rivera was from Panama, one of the greatest players in the history of the game. He's from Panama. So that's a tiny example of what ethnocentrism means. It's the inability of a society to view the world through any other prism but its own prism. If you may, it's a self-centered approach to the world. Here's the scientific definition of ethnocentrism, which is a term used widely in social anthropology and sociology. Evaluation of other cultures according to preconceptions originating in the standards and customs of one's own culture. So if you may, it's some sort of a lack of sensitivity to other, to differences, to cultural differences. Israel's society is highly ethnocentric. There is an unusually high number of physical and conceptual threats that really molded this ethnocentric approach to the world. Then you have, of course, the role of the Jewish tradition, the notion of the Jews as the chosen people. And again, I'm not talking about the way this is being perceived by others, but the chosen people makes, the notion that I'm special. In Hebrew, ata bechartanu, you chose us. We are special. We are self-centered. It's a narcissistic notion to begin with, culturally, religiously, theologically. And of course, you have Israel's anxiety agents. These are institutions within Israeli society that always try to highlight threat as opposed to opportunity, to give precedent to threats and to downplay opportunity. Who are those anxiety agents in Israeli society? Of course, the political echelon. The political echelon always, whether it's 1948 or 2023, the political echelon always wants to highlight the threats. It helps them galvanize political support. It helps them with getting the people to participate and so on. Then you have the mainstream media, which in Israel plays a very important role in cultivating anxiety. And the pundits. The pundits are the commentators, the people that sit in the studios and television studios and just talk about the situation, analyze the situation. Here is an unrelated example of ethnocentrism, just to show you how ethnocentrism works, ethnocentrism in play. These are pictures from a very happy day in the history of the state of Israel, perhaps one of the happiest days in the history of the state of Israel. That's the day in 1977, where a small team of Division II and III basketball players in Israel called Maccabi Tel Aviv won the first European championship in basketball in 1977. On the way to the final game, which took place in May of 1977, they defeated the Red Army team of the Soviet Union, which was the most invested basketball team in the world. The Soviets invested in their basketball team way more than any American basketball team, probably more than several teams combined in term because now this event was communicated to us. And I remember that when this happened, I was 15 years old. And what you see here is Tal Brody, the captain of the team, is a dear friend of mine, holding the cup right here. And here you see a picture of young people. This is about midnight of the night we won the first European Championship, jumping into the fountain in front of the City Hall of Tel Aviv. Now, I was there. I'm one of those kids that you see there. Okay, I'm 15 years old that night. Now, the Israeli media is communicating to us that this was perhaps the biggest event in basketball's history. Right? The whole world is aware of our achievement. Well, it took me years to realize that this event was not really celebrated outside of Israel because basketball was not important in Europe. And even in Russia, basketball was not important. The only reason the Soviets cultivated a basketball team was the Cold War. They wanted to defeat the Americans in their game, which they managed to do 5 years earlier in 1972. But my point is that this is a perfect example of how ethnocentric forces are in play, convincing the Israelis that this was a globally celebrated event. And there's a movie that came out several years ago, a wonderful documentary about this game called On the Map. And for many basketball fans, it's their first encounter with the really exceptional achievement of Israel's team at that time in 1977. But it was certainly not an achievement that was known outside of the boundaries of the state of Israel. Even in Europe, very few people were aware of that game and that championship. Now, media coverage in Israel is designed to highlight threats and downplay opportunities. This has been going on for many, many years, and there are many reasons for it, which I will not go into. It's a fascinating subject. Daniel Bartal, perhaps one of the most important social psychologists in Israel, coined the term siege mentality. He says the following: Israeli Jews harbor the belief that the world has negative behavioral intentions toward them. This belief reflects their deeply embedded siege mentality. A long history of persecutions and hatred throughout the world, epitomized by the Holocaust, has grounded this siege mentality in the Jewish tradition. In the present century, and he's referring to the 21st century, the beliefs of siege mentality playing an important role in Zionistic ideology have become part of the Israeli ethos. These beliefs have an influence on Israeli attitudes and behaviors, causing mistrust and negative attitudes towards the world, sensitivity to information coming from the world, pressure to conform among the Israeli Jews, and self-defensive acts. It is suggested that within the framework of siege mentality, beliefs and their consequence, the Israeli way of managing the Middle Eastern conflict can be understood. So that what Daniel Bartal is saying is very profound. And by the way, he's not being critical of it. He's just stating a fact. Generations and generations of persecution, certainly culminating with the Holocaust, creating this very low level of trust in the world. And the fact that we are surrounded by enemies, if you may, some people refer to siege mentality as the Masada complex. We see ourselves all as a collective on top of Masada, as a nation. And we're being threatened. And we feel everything is being translated as an existential threat. I was just on a Zoom call earlier today, webinar, with 3 leading American academics in the field of international relations, trying to analyze the impact of 10/7 on the global arena. And there was an Israeli professor, an Israeli political scientist in the call, who's supposed to be an academic. And he expressed the view that Hamas is presenting an existential threat to the state of Israel. And I couldn't help it, but it was like the most ethnocentric statement. It's not an academic statement, it was a political statement. This is what a politician would say, not an academic. And I had to intervene. And I think I kind of embarrassed the poor guy. But I said, how dare you say that Hamas represents an existential threat to a country that has nuclear power, that has one of the most robust economies in the world, with 10.5 million people, highly motivated to protect and defend themselves, with support from world Jewry, from support from the United States, support from Germany, support from the UK and Canada and Australia and so on and so forth. How can you say that? But that's ethnocentrism in action. And you have to understand that if you want to understand the mood of the country, Israelis may be resilient, they may be excellent in what they do, still they are haunted by their history. If you may, Amos Oz used to say the following definitive description of Israeli psyche. During the day, we fight the Arabs, he said, but during the nights, we still fight the Nazis. The late Amos Oz succinctly described the mentality that Daniel Bartal is talking about. And again, it's not a criticism of Israeli society. That's the way it is. That's how Israelis are shaped. And I think it affects everything. It even affects the way they do business. What are the possible scenarios? I said at the beginning that the jury is still out. We don't know what kind of Israeli society will emerge out of 10-7, and this may take years. So there are three big scenarios, but I'll sum it. I'll basically reduce them to two big scenarios to make it easier. The first is that Israeli society, as a result of 10-7, will become even more radically ethnocentric, meaning less trust in the world, less willingness to collaborate with the world, less willingness to engage in any kind of political resolution, sinking into belief that we're doomed to live by the sword. And of course, this would have dire implications because living by the sword is not a strategy. Young Israelis like my children are not going to stay here if the state of Israel will not be able to design a viable horizon for them. Young people that have the option to go elsewhere will do it. Israel is not going to be attractive, not even to American Jews, only to a certain type of American Jews, as one big, gigantic collective bunker. Being a military bunker is not a strategy for a nation. But there's a danger that 10-7 will do exactly that. That Israeli society will emerge out of 10-7 more radical, more militant, more willing to sacrifice. And the downside of it is that they will lose all the people that are not interested in that kind of future, that want to see a political horizon. And again, Israelis are not naive. We'll talk about that when we talk about political horizon. They're not naive. The other scenario is more pragmatic. It's the scenario that says, we didn't think on October 6, 1973, that 6 years later, we'll have a peace with the Egyptians. And 4 years later, Anwar Sadat, the most bitter enemy of Israel, will show up in Jerusalem and will address the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. Right? So those people say 10-7 could and should produce a big change in the Israeli system, a big change in the relationship between the legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch, a big change in the what we call, the division of labor. We want every sector in Israeli society to pitch in and to contribute to the national effort. That would require the ultra-Orthodox, for example, to join the army, and so on and so forth. There's so many things that a pragmatic, progressive approach will be interested in achieving. Whether they will have the political power to do so or not, we don't know. But these are really the two major forces that will compete over Israel's future post 10-7. The radicalization scenario would, by definition, require a rise in the political influence of the far-right parties. It will be manifested by less interface with the global agenda. Less, as I mentioned, it's a byproduct of reduced level of trust in the world. And of course, growing religiosity will be, I think, a byproduct of it as well. The other side of this would require willingness to consider some sort of an arrangement with the Palestinians, reforming Israel's security doctrine. 10-7 exposed a massive failure in the security doctrine, reforming Israel's governance, and solidifying the so-called Israeli Bill of Rights, meaning introducing changes to the legislation that will secure the rights of everybody. Now, talking about a possible arrangement with the Palestinians, and I'm aware of the fact that many Americans and I've heard the president of the United States, Joe Biden, talking about the two-state solution. Many people are already working on it, and I see articles in the New York Times and elsewhere about, everybody's talking about peace. But let's spend a moment to try and understand what is the definition of peace in North America, in Europe, and what is the definition of peace right here in the Middle East. Peace in the Middle East means let's not kill each other. Peace means non-belligerency. Let me give you an example. Israel signed the peace treaty with Egypt, peace, quote unquote, with Egypt. Until this very day, not even one Israeli book was translated into Arabic and distributed in Egypt. Until this very day, decades after we signed peace with the Egyptians, not even one Israeli movie was shown in Egypt. All that while, we showed Egyptian movies on Israeli television every Friday afternoon for decades. Egyptian literature was translated into Hebrew. I studied Egyptian poetry in high school way before we had peace with Egypt. So when you say peace in America, you mean peace between the United States and Canada. When you say peace in the Middle East, you're actually referring to non-belligerency. Big, big, big difference. This is why normalization is required. Normalization is another added layer to the concept of peace. Ariel Sharon used to say that what we are looking for are livable arrangements. That was his definition of peace. Okay, so let's agree, first of all, not to kill each other. That's peace. But let's also form some sort of a livable arrangement, an arrangement that will allow both of us to live side by side without killing each other. I don't want you to be my friend. I don't want you to love me. I don't expect you to like me. Let's just not kill each other. That's peace in the Middle East. That's not peace between the US and Canada. That's not peace between the UK and I don't know, between Italy and France. Now, the future Israeli-Palestinian arrangement that some people refer to as a two-state solution would have to require the following elements. The first is everybody agrees, post 10-7, that whatever entity the Palestinians will have, which could be described as, let's say, self-rule, because, again, Israelis will not accept it, not after 10-7. So it will have to be demilitarized. What does it mean? They will not allow to have an army. They will not have a navy. They will not have an air force. They will not have commando units like Hamas had and deployed on 10-7 and so on. The borders will be controlled by other entities, not by them. In the case of Gaza, more likely Israelis and Egyptians. The internal affairs of Gaza, assuming, again, that Hamas rule ends at one point and Hamas leadership is out, whether by expulsion or other ways, someone will have to get involved with the internal affairs of Gaza. Who will govern Gaza? Will it be the heads of the tribes, the head of the family clans? Would it be a pan-Arabist, some kind of formula, the Saudis and the Egyptians and others? Will it be an international force? Will Israel will be the dominant force? We don't know all the answers to those questions, but the internal affairs will also have to be there has to be an external intervention. Even when it comes to the curriculum, we can't allow them to continue to teach their children such anti-Semitic curriculum. This cannot go on. This cannot be allowed post 10/7. That would require massive diplomatic support. Just to give you an example, when the U.S. decided to attack the Yemenis, the Houthis in Yemen, they put together an international coalition of no less than 20 different countries. That's diplomacy. In the meantime, Israel is not even close to that in terms of the ability to build a robust diplomatic umbrella that is committed to all the things that I'm talking about. That requires such a high level of diplomatic creativity that I don't see happening right now. May happen in the future, but right now it's not happening. And then, of course, comes the question of, do you want the two-state solution or you want a three-state solution? Meaning, do you want Gaza to be an independent entity and the West Bank to be an independent entity, albeit self-ruled? Don't call it a state, call it whatever you want to call it. Or you want them to be connected. If you want them to be connected, there has to be a physical connection. How do you create a physical connection? It has to be contiguous. How do you do that? Well, one way is to just designate a highway that will link, let's say, Gaza with Hebron, and that's how you have a connection between Gaza and the West Bank. Another way is to create an overpass that will be just for Palestinian vehicles. Another way is to create a tunnel. But it is possible. Those things were discussed years ago within the framework of the Oslo Accords, within the framework of other peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. And lastly, someone will have to pick up the tab. Who's going to pay for this? We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild a Palestinian society. And make no mistake, Israelis don't think that the Palestinian society will emerge out of such a plan, such a Marshall Plan, like the German society or like the Japanese society. The German society, if you think about it, and I know there are many people here on the call or second generation and in some cases even survivors, what happened in Germany is remarkable. Germany is the country that was responsible to the two biggest calamities in the 20th century, World War I, World War II. During World War II, they were chiefly responsible for the killing of tens of millions of people, for the annihilation of 1/3 of our people, the Jewish people. Perhaps the worst case of pre-civilizational behavior in the history of humankind, presented by Germany in the 20th century. Brutality, hatred, ignorance, anti-Semitism, racism, fascism, bigotry, the industrial killing of Jews and gays and communists and handicapped people. Unbelievable what happened in Germany. Yet, the Americans came to this brutal, violent society that produced Nazism and turned it into an open, pluralistic, democratic, pacifistic society. How did that happen? Incredible achievement, perhaps the biggest achievement in the history of American foreign policy. What happened in Germany and Japan post-World War II. Now, Israelis are not naive. This is not going to happen with the Palestinians. This is not going to happen with the Palestinians. And as I said, the best that we can aspire for, and I hope that the Americans and the Canadians and the British and the Germans are understanding this. The best that we can hope for is a livable arrangement. Let's not kill each other and find a way to be productive, have a normal life, side by side. We don't expect you to like us, and we don't expect us to like you. And on this happy note, I'd like to open the floor.
Could you talk about what's happening up north right now in Israel with Hezbollah?
So the good news is that it seems like Hezbollah hasn't really decided to join in. And there are many reasons for that. One of them is the fact that the last time they were engaged in the Syrian civil war, they lost about one half of their fighting force in Syria. Another reason is they remember the reaction of Israel in 2006, June, July of 2006. The Second Lebanon War created what we call a deterrent. That deterrent apparently is still in place. But they do agitate, that's the bad news. They do agitate Israel. They do provoke Israel to local military activity. I must say that I was personally surprised that Hamas did not join, that Hezbollah did not join Hamas. I was convinced, and maybe because I was under the shock of what happened on October 7th, I personally was convinced, and probably you guys heard me say that, I was convinced that we are going to face a multi-front military challenge that will include Hamas from the south, Hezbollah from the north, pro-Iranian militias from Syria, Islamist groups in the West Bank, and even Arab Israelis, which was the Iranian playbook, which was the Iranian fantasy, that was the Iranian plan, and it did not happen. I guess we will have to learn more about why it did not happen, but right now, it looks like Hezbollah hasn't made the decision to engage in a full confrontation with Israel.
Many American Jews complain that Israel has terrible PR on its own behalf. How justified do you think this view is?
Yeah, so and what I'm about to say, it doesn't mean that Israel has great PR. Of course, you can always have better PR. Even the United States can use better PR. But PR is not the problem. The problem is one of positioning. What does it mean by that? What is positioning? Positioning is the actions that you take in order to improve your position vis-a-vis your competition. What's Israel's competition? Some people mistakenly think that Israel's competition is the Palestinians or the Arab world. No. Israel's competition, for all intents and purposes, is in Europe, is in North America. These are the markets where we want to grow. Israel's competition is not the Palestinians. And Tel Aviv's competition is not Ramallah. And Jerusalem competition is not Cairo. Tel Aviv's competition is Berlin and Barcelona. And Jerusalem competition is Athens and Paris. That's how we should look at it. Now, what does it mean positioning? Human tendency, human nature is to identify with the underdog. It's very difficult for us to understand that the underdog can be wrong. It's very difficult for us to understand that the underdog can be violent, can be deadly, can be brutal, can be cruel. Very difficult. Think about ourselves. What do we do when we see a little baby? Big smile. What do we do when we see a little puppy? What do we do when we watch a game between two teams when one team is leading the by far, like 50 points? Our sympathies usually go to the underdog because the underdog is viewed in our brain as helpless, defenseless, weak, needs our help. And Israel occupied the position of the underdog from the early days of pre-Zionism, mid-19th century, through the pogroms, of course, through the Holocaust, through the 1948 War of Independence, where Israel clearly was the underdog, all the way to 67 and 73, which was the last time Israel firmly occupied the position of the underdog. Then something happened. And by the way, it's not that we had good PR, but until that point, as long as we held the position of the underdog, Israel was popular in popular culture in Hollywood, right? Israel attracted. There's a Frank Sinatra cafeteria at the Hebrew University right here, 5 minutes from here, right? Barbara Streisand, all those big names openly supported Israel because Israel clearly was the underdog until 73. Then what happened? Something dramatic happened. And again, Israel being this self-centered, ethnocentric society, less really interested and connected with the world, Israeli society has yet to understand the importance of what happened in June of 1982. That was the year when Israel inadvertently, this was not the intention, lost the position of the underdog. That's the year when there was a switch in the positioning of Israel. We went from being the regional David to becoming the regional Goliath, at least in the eyes of the world. We invaded Lebanon, an invasion that was viewed by most of the world and many world Jews and many Israelis as an unnecessary invasion. That, by the way, caused Israel. We spent 18 years in Lebanon. We lost hundreds and hundreds of soldiers. And again, the reason why we went into Lebanon, our leadership at the time, and in particular Menachem Begin, was deeply ethnocentric. Menachem Begin was motivated by the very same siege mentality. To his credit, I would say he was genuine, he was authentic. He was not manipulative, he was not deceptive. He just made a wrong decision. But he truly believed in what he did. He was convinced the Israeli army is perfect. He was convinced we were invincible. I remember very vividly as a young soldier how he threatened Assad. He said to him, Yanush and Raful are waiting for you. He was euphoric. He had no idea that the damage to Israel's positioning is strategic and long-term, because since 1982, it's been downhill. Then he had in December of 1987, the first Intifada and then the second Intifada. There was for a brief moment that Israel resumed to occupy the position of the underdog in 1991 when Saddam Hussein attacked Israel with 39 Scud missiles, but that was short-lived. Since then, we became we occupy firmly the position of the regional force, the side in the conflict that has the might, the military might, the economic might, and the numbers are on our side. It's very difficult to convince the world that you are the underdog under these conditions. So that's essentially what happens when people talk about Israel's PR problem. I want you to remember, in the first place, it's a positioning problem, not a PR problem. Not that Israel's PR is perfect.
What is your vision of peace borders with the Palestinians while there are so many Jewish settlements in the West Bank? Do you have a vision?
Yeah, so this would have to require, again, a very creative solution, because there are hundreds of thousands of Jews in the West Bank. Again, depends how you're counting them, because if you take the most extreme definition of the armistice lines taken by the Palestinians and the pro-Palestinian entities, that major parts of Jerusalem are considered to be settlers. And even where I live, and Mevaseret Zion, which is the neighboring community, and so on. So on the seam line, but the armistice line is just the line where the forces happen to be when the war ended. Right? It doesn't signify any historical, moral, or even topographical significance. So it depends on how you define. I guess I could envision a situation where the remote Jewish communities could be consolidated, and the major centers of Jewish presence in the West Bank could remain. And again, remember Ariel Sharon's formula. Let's agree not to kill each other, then the rest will fall into place. I'm surrounded by 3 Palestinian villages. I've been here for over 20 years. We had one terrorist attack at the checkpoint outside of our community 5 years ago, where one Palestinian killed 3 Israelis. One of them was an Arab Israeli, and he was taken out by an Israeli female soldier. And that was right here, about 500 meters from where I am right now. So on October 7th, you can understand the kind of anxiety that we had here, because the only thing that stands between us and 3 very hostile Palestinian villages is a fence. And the same thing that happened to the kibbutzim could have happened here. Exactly the same. And so we are acutely aware of the situation. But again, as I said before, let's arrive at this basic assumption, basic formula of non-belligerency, and then we can build on that,
That
just
is
as we do in sports.
so interesting, right? Because as Americans, we are looking at it from our, like you said, through our prism. And how about this last question? What about the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish? Most of them Israeli Arabs. How is October 7th impacting them?
Yeah, so one of the Hamas made an endless number of mistakes on October 7th. They underestimated Israelis. They underestimated the Arab world. They underestimated Hezbollah. They were wrong across the board. One of the worst mistakes that they made is that they killed Muslims too, tens of Muslims.
Hmm.
And because it was documented by them, because it was uploaded, those videos,
Yes.
were viewed by hundreds of millions of Muslims. And it's the main reason why Arab Israelis are relatively quiet. We've never seen this before. During other previous rounds of violence with Gaza, Arab Israelis were demonstrating. In some cases, we had really inflammation of dramatic violence, lynching in the streets of Bat Yam and Lod and Ramla and places like that. Akko, it's not happening this time. And the reason why it's not happening is because of Hamas's, the fact that Hamas massacred Muslims too. And I think that was one of Hamas's biggest mistakes, because it also affected the Muslim world. Imagine you have Saudi Arabia that, despite of Israel's harsh response in Gaza, is still talking about normalization with Israel. This is unheard of, never happened in the history of the conflict in the Middle East. So I think that now this is not to say that that Arab Israelis will keep quiet for forever. I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody can predict the future, but I think that if we will handle it correctly, if we will not, if we will find the solution to the problem of Gaza right now, to find again, reach that level where we achieve a sufficient achievement that Israeli public can live with, the release of the hostages, the expulsion of Hamas leadership, and the crippling of Hamas military power, then I think we could end this. And I hope that this day will come sooner than later.